Let me begin with a view of sky. We can see the Orion constellation, and in the central star is this object here, which today as the Orion Nebula Cluster.
Sorry, Pavel, we have more noise in your voice. Can you please stop? Yeah, please stop for a few seconds to see what's the problem. Purya? Purya, do you have also noise in Pavel's voice?
Yes.
So is it because of the net that he used, or?
I think my computer seems to be very active. But I don't have any other programs. Turn off the mail. So still hear me?
If I yes, I can hear you, but with a little bit noise.
Yeah, I think the computer decided to put a fan, I'm afraid. So shall I just continue then? Yeah.
Vahid says that it is because of poor connection. I'm not sure if it is because of poor connection.
Maybe changing the nets be a solution. If Pavel can change his net, it means that the problem.
Log in with mobile, for example?
Yes, for example, with mobile network.
Pavel, if you log in with your mobile and just to use the, I mean, for audio, not I mean, you can control your slide with your computer, but we can hear your voice via your mobile.
Okay, let's see. Link for testing. I have to now find the address.
We had the same problem yesterday, and we resolved that in this way.
Link for me. Get it fast. So now I'm clicking on the phone on the icon. Yes, sign in. Yes. So thank you for this invitation. It's great to give this talk. And I will start with. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. So I will now start with a picture of Orion on the sky. As you will recognize the belt of Orion, and here is in the center of the sword of Orion, we have the Orion Nebula Cluster. It's an H2 region. And on this object, this is quite nicely pointed out. There are nearly 2,000 publications up until 2018, and so one would wonder whether one could discover anything new on this object. And well, that's quite surprising that some new discoveries have been made. Now, this object is about 450 parsecs away from us, and it is the closest region which is producing O stars. So we have here a fully observed going from dwarfs up to the solar masses approximately. And mentioning the IMF, you might want to visit this YouTube site here, where there is a cosmic duologue between Teresa Yarabkova and Andrew Hopkins on the IMF. This is, I think, very interesting for students to look at. So The Orion Nebula Cluster contains about 1,000 stars, could be also 3,000. It's about 1,000,000 years old and very compact. The central trapezium has a dimension of only 0.05 parsecs. So it takes about 10,000 years to cross through the central region. If we zoom in on the trapezium, with the Hubble Space Telescope, you can see the innermost objects, these O stars. This one is Theta 1 Orionis C, which is doing most of the ionizing. And you can see these propellets as they are being evaporated by the by the radiative action of this massive star. This is here how we understand this object. The cluster is seen here. The observer is at this position, looking at the cluster, which is at this edge of the whole molecular cloud, and it's produced a Champagne outflow, so gas which is being ionized at this photo association region, flowing out high velocity. So here we have something like 10,000 Kelvin, and here something like 10 Kelvin. So it's like an explosive outburst of gas. Its ionization front is moving quite rapidly inwards, and we are seeing it from this direction. Sensors of the stars by people like Hillenbrand and collaborators tell us that in this region, which spans something like 2 parsecs overall, in radius are about 3,500 systems. So many of them are binaries. Central density is immensely high. It's about nearly 100,000 stars per cubic parsec at this innermost region. And it might have, of course, been higher about 1,000,000 years ago. The HR diagram tells us it's very young. So we have here the luminosity of the stars versus the effective temperature. And all these objects are members of the Orion Nebula Cluster. And we can see that they are between the 0.1 and about 2 million year ISO age lines, and well above the main sequence. These 2 blue tracks are the pre-main sequence contraction track of a 0.6 and a 0.4 solar mass star, assuming classical pre-main sequence tracks. So this object is extremely young. It seems to have just erupted from the clouds. And then on then other clusters I'm going to mention in this presentation are the Pleiades, which is about 100 million years old and contained initially perhaps 4,000 stars, and now about 1,000 stars. Then going up in mass scale, we have NGC 3603, which is 2 million years old approximately and contains about 10,000 stars. It's very compact. And then going up in mass even further, we have here 36 in the LMC, which contains something like 100,000 stars. And it's again about 2 million years old, very compact. So the initial cluster radia and the expansion problem. One hypothesis is that these clusters form from merging of subclusters. This is a very popular hypothesis now, but it doesn't work. So we've investigated this with Sambran Banire, and basically all of these clusters, the Orion Nebula Cluster 3603 and R136, are too compact and too young to be possible for them to merge hierarchically. So that doesn't work. What we then did is to look at, to use the wide binaries as a test of how compact these clusters could have been when they were formed. So for example, the Pleiades, you can see here in this diagram, which is showing the birth density of the cluster versus birth mass of the cluster. So the Pleiades has a much lower density, but we calculated based on the observed population of binaries in this cluster, how compact it was allowed to be so that the widest binaries which we see today survived. And we did this exercise for all these different clusters plotted here. And so this here shows the birth density versus the birth mass in comparison with molecular cloud scores. So you can see that it's a nice overlap of the data. So these are pre-star forming molecular clouds. Already they might have some protostars, and they nicely agree with our inferred birth densities of all these different clusters. These, interestingly, another argument gave us the birth densities of globular clusters, which you can see would have been extremely high if this argument published in Marx and myself were true. And the remarkable result is that this population seems to be an extension of what we see happening in the Milky Way today. And so this analysis suggests that the clusters formed very compact. We can extract a half mass radius versus birth mass relation, and you can see that it's of the order of 0.1 parsecs if this were one solar mass. But of course, if we go up to 10,000 solar masses, this becomes something like a fraction of a parsec, still very compact. So that's a result of these clusters. And let me continue. I'm trying to remember what the next slide is. It takes time for me to see the next slide. There was a blank slide. So from evidence from molecular clouds. Well, it's quite remarkable that this dimension of 0.1 parsecs seems to be evident in the structure of molecular clouds already. So we see here a fraction of the Taurus molecular clouds, and these people, in particular Hakar and collaborators, have been finding that the stars form in these filaments. So you can see that they are a fraction of a parsec, about 0.1 parsec in width, and the protostars are located in these structures. Now, the width of these is indeed small. This is a histogram from the review of André, telling us the number of filaments versus the width of these filaments. One can see that they are clustering around 0.1 parsecs. From the same review, one finds, or André et al. Discuss, that embedded clusters form in the intersection of these filaments. So the embedded clusters themselves have dimensions which are a little bit larger, but not much larger than this dimension here. And this is remarkably consistent with the independent finding we obtained from these present-day clusters using the wide binaries. That is very encouraging. The problem, though, is that these clusters would form very compact, and then they have to expand to the present-day sizes, which is about 3 parsecs. That can be achieved if they expel 60 to 70% of their mass of unused gas quickly. So these are n-body simulations showing the effective radius versus time of models which start very compact, and the massive clusters are up here, the less massive clusters are down here. They expel gas and then they revirialize to these radii. These symbols here are clusters in the Milky Way, local group, and other systems. You can see that the models actually achieve these radii if these clusters, which form very compact, expel a large fraction, 60 to 70% of their mass, and that has to be done quickly, but not instantaneously. Can this work? So this works if the star formation efficiency is about 1/3, so 30%. And the question is if it actually can physically work. So is there enough feedback energy produced by these clusters to remove the gas so quickly and such a large fraction of it? So this, the star formation efficiency, we know from surveys like by Charlie Larder and Elizabeth Larder and Tom McGeeth et al., is observed to be definitely less than 40%. Here is the survey by McGeeth et al. Of the Orion star-forming regions. Here is the Orion Nebula Cluster. So this is a piece of the sky we are seeing in parsec, in dimensions of parsecs versus parsecs. So this is basically right ascension declination. And all the stars which are found, the very young stars, are in these clusters, embedded clusters. And this is Orion B, which is located up here relative to this cloud. And again, these young stars are in these embedded clusters. And in these embedded clusters, these authors have measured the amount of mass in stars versus the amount of mass in gas. And the result is here. So the star formation efficiency versus mass of the embedded clusters is always less than 30%. Now, these are still very young objects, so presumably more stars are forming, but very, very rarely, in fact, never does one approach a star formation efficiency which is above 40%. Thus, this is a fairly solid observationally or empirically derived star formation efficiency. The question is now, can the gas be removed, 70 or 60% of the gas? One question one can ask is the amount of energy available. So the binding energy of the cloud in stars and gas, given the initial radius of the embedded cluster, can be expressed as this equation here. The crossing time of such a structure is given by this equation. So that's the time it takes for a star to once cross through the system. We can then calculate the binding energy for embedded clusters of 10 to the 4 and to the 5 solar masses, being this number here. And the crossing times would be this here if the radius is 1 parsec. So actually it would be shorter if it's less than 1 parsec. Now, a single 15 solar mass star injects this amount of energy in this amount of time. And an 85 solar mass star would inject this amount of energy. So we can see, comparing these energies and timescales, that yes, if one has an O star in such clusters, and usually they have many O stars, within less than a crossing time, more energy is injected than the binding energy of the whole object. So in principle, there is way enough energy to unbind the system through the action of the ionizing stars. Now, one can also look at observations, and here we see in the antennae galaxies, which are an interacting pair of galaxies, these star-forming regions which have already expelled the gas. These are a few million-year-old super or even hypermassive clusters of star clusters. And these authors here have observed that the gas is leaving these systems with a velocity of about 25 to 30 kilometers per second, which means that the evacuation time scale is comparable to the crossing time, if not even shorter. So this indicates that, yes, gas expulsion seems to be explosive in these extremely massive clusters of the scale of 10 to the 5 or so solar masses. Locally nearby, we have this treasure chest cluster. It's extremely compact. You can see the radius is small. It's very young, as far as one can trust such ages. And the H2 region is observed to be expanding with about 12 kilometers per second, suggesting that the evacuation time scale is indeed about 100,000 years, again indicating a quick evacuation time scale. So it does seem that looking at such objects, which have good data, that in the presence of O stars, explosive gas expulsion may drive early cluster evolution largely independently of the cluster mass. This conclusion has been reached, as you can see, quite some time ago. What do these, given this evidence, what do N-body models tell us? Well, if you look at the Pleiades, which is shown in this circle here, which has an age of about 100 million years, and a present-day mass of about 1,000 solar masses, there are two possibilities for its birth mass. The one is the classical number. If you just take the Pleiades back in time with an N-body simulation, one will arrive at an initial mass of about maybe 1,500 solar masses. So the cluster is born here with that mass and then just evaporates its stars slowly through the tubal relaxation process to reach the current mass. However, the astrophysical argument suggests that the Pleiades probably formed with this mass, about 4,000 solar masses, and the ionizing stars explosively removed the gas, the residual gas, such that a large fraction of the gas left, and the cluster very quickly depopulated, losing many of its stars because of the unbinding of the large fraction of the potential, and the cluster would end up with its present mass here. This has various implications because these stars lost should be evident around the cluster still today, so that's something we are now looking for with Franta Dinbir and maybe other people. Plus, we have the situation that the Orion Nebula Cluster, which looks very much like a pre-Pleiades cluster, would expand to the Pleiades within 100 million years. This looks quite well. So the Pleiades today has 1/3 its stars and 2/3 are outside of it, expanding away from the Pleiades. And so we have this vision or this understanding that the ONC expands to the Pleiades, and the Pleiades actually then evolve to the Hyades cluster with another 500 million years. This step from ONC to the Pleiades goes with an inflation in radius, a significant inflation radius. And this is actually evident in a collation of clusters you see here by Wolfgang Brandner, published also quite some time ago. So we have here the NGC 3603 cluster at an age of about 1 million years, very compact. Then we have the Arches cluster at an age of about 2 million years, which, as you can see, has about the same morphology and density. At the older age of 3 to 5 million years, the clusters already look expanded. You can see the Westerlund 1 and quintuplet clusters here at similar ages, and then this cluster here at an age of 7 to 12 million years looks even more expanded. And all of these are plotted to the same physical scale. So this here is 1 parsec. A recent publication by Getman et al. Appears to confirm this expansion of clusters in the early time. So this suggests that expulsion of residual gas and then the expansion of the cluster seems to be evident in the data, as well as being theoretically well motivated and actually expected. Remarkable is that by looking at these type of objects in these very different mass scales from 10 to 10 to the 5 solar masses, one derives an incredible universality of the star formation process. We see here that in all of these cases, we reproduce the observed objects if the star formation efficiency is 1/3, if the gas is expelled with 10 kilometers per second, and if it starts being expelled after about 600,000 years. So that this delay time corresponds to the lifetime of the ultra-compact H2 region. These numbers come out of N-body modeling to these systems. The observational evidence for these numbers is entirely independent, and it would be a coincidence if it were not correct physically, I would argue. Now, we seem to have a fairly good understanding of how these clusters form, and so this is where things start becoming a little bit complicated. So we think that star clusters form in one continuous event. Feedback of massive stars truncates star formation and destroys the gas and dust. This is a slide from Teresa Irabkova. You can see the results, and we thought we understood this very well. In the Orion Nebula Cluster, 3 spatially distinct and age-separated stellar populations have been found, tragically. This means that all of this, what we thought would be working, because these 3 populations need to be explained. Here's the observational evidence. This is the discovery paper by Beccari et al. Using small telescopes, ESO astronomer, and this is the luminosity color diagram, R versus R minus I. This is the 1 sequence. This is the next sequence and the third sequence, separated in age. If you rotate this up vertically, make a histogram, these are the populations along the sequences. This is the youngest sequence, of years old. This is about 1.5 million years old, and this is something like 2.5 million years old. In the Orion Nebula Cluster, which is thought to be one single burst, basically. This has been verified using Gaia Data Release 2 by Yerabkova et al. So there's good evidence that this is actually correct. Now, how can this be understood? And that's quite nice, actually, because we do have a model, and this is called repeated stellar dynamical termination of feedback halted filament accretion model. Now, I haven't been able to find a better word for this or an acronym. So we have a complicated title, but the key may be stellar dynamical ejections. So in a cluster, 3 stars meet and they can eject each other from the cluster. In embedded clusters, the densities are very high, so such encounters are actually quite common. And furthermore, the pre-existing stellar binaries enhance the likelihood of ejection events significantly. As we know, most stars, basically every star, seems to be formed as a binary system simply because of angular momentum conservation when the stars are forming. And so the idea is the following. This cartoon produced by Teresa Rabkova. And so we have here a filament in which gas inflow into this overdensity begins to form an embedded cluster. And this is what would happen and end when the ionizing stars appear. The ionizing stars would ionize the gas and the show would be finished, the cluster would expand, and it would be done. But if just a handful of O stars form in the core, they expel each other with a high likelihood. If they expel each other, the ionizing sources are gone, the cluster expands because yes, gas has been expelled, terminating star formation. But the thing is that if these ionizing stars are gone, the gas flow can resume and new molecular material can fall in, forming a next generation of stars. Here. Now, these themselves will form ionizing stars, which would stop the formation of the second population, but they too eject with a high likelihood, expanding the second population. And so when they are gone, molecular material can again fall in and form the third sequence, or third population. Remarkably, one can assume the IMF is an optimally distribution function and predict the masses of the most massive stars in the first population, and they have been found. They are called AE Auriga, Mu Colo, I forgot the name, Coloni, but CO, well, this star and Iota Orionis. And it actually has known that these 3 stars have been ejected when the first ONC population formed. So these stars are massive ionizing stars. They are about 2.5 million years old, and these authors here, Hoegewerf and Gualindris et al., have shown that they have been ejected from the cluster about 2.5 million years ago. And they, as I mentioned, if the IMF is an optimally sample distribution function and not a probability density distribution function, then these masses, these stars, can be predicted in the first population. These are the trajectories on the sky. This is the distance from us and the galactic longitude. The 3 stars are here, and this is now in the context of the Orion constellation. One can trace the orbits back in the galactic potential, finding that 2.5 million years ago, they were very close to the Orion Nebula Cluster.
Sorry, Pavel, I interrupt you. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm basically finished.
Yeah, okay, good.
So, yeah, good. The conclusions are that quite remarkably, small telescopes can yield big results. This is doubly remarkably because it's small telescopes, but also they have significantly affected our understanding of how these type of small embedded clusters, which still produce ionizing stars, might form. The detailed formation of star clusters has become a much more dynamic and interesting problem. Of course, one can do these calculations now with the full hydrodynamical codes, including radiation transfer. to see how the actual details work. And it is what I find it incredibly beautiful how we can now read off from the sky the detailed physical sequence of star formation over a few million years, even down to individual stellar masses, if the IMF is not a probability density distribution function. This is where I would like to end. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Pavel, for a very nice talk. So we have about 5 minutes, even more, 6 minutes for questions. Any question? Yeah, Mohammed Hosseini Rat has typed. Can you read the question, Pavel? Could you please?
Yes, the question is by Mohammed Hosseini Rat. Could you please give more details about your 0.1 parsec scale in embedded clusters? That is very remarkable. If there is a reasonable relation between the scale and the famous 0.1 parsec scale in filamentary paradigm, how can one understand it? Yes, I also find this is indeed most remarkable. And so what we did, and this is before the time I or my collaborators knew of these filaments. So we were working in a sense blindly, but the idea was to infer the initial conditions of star formation. The overall aim is to be able to construct a galaxy from its star-forming events in a stellar dynamical sense. For that, we need to know how to seed the galaxy with young stars, and they form basically exclusively embedded clusters. And we needed the radii of these. And so the idea was just to use the binding energy distribution of the observed binaries in the older clusters like Pleiades, Praesepe, to infer the most compact state these clusters are allowed to have had for the observed binary population to survive. Yeah, because if you have the wide binaries and you make the cluster too compact, these binaries are dissociated. They wouldn't be able to exist today. And so that's how we went back in time and for each of these clusters inferred the allowed initial density, assuming, of course, that the binary population is universal, just like the IMF in the Milky Way. So under that assumption, we derived this radius mass relation for the embedded clusters from which clusters like the Pleiades, Praesepe, and the others formed. And it then turns out that this radius mass relation appears very comparable to the filaments of one sees in these molecular clouds. Why the filaments have the 0.1 parsec thickness nearly universally, I think is still something of a mystery that is not fully understood. But it seems that these filaments form, and then within a 0.1 parsec, the molecular material becomes isothermal, very cold, and more or less still. And so it seems to stop its contraction for some time, at least it slows its contraction. But why one has this particular scale, I don't know. And that's currently an active research area by people like Philip, André, Hakar, and others.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And also, Asiye Yacobi is asking about the age differences between different populations in Orion Nebula Cluster.
Yes, so I took out that slide because I thought I wouldn't have enough time to have it in there. I had a table from the Beccari et al. Paper which documents the ages. So I don't know it off by heart, and I can't now get to it because it's on my computer. But the oldest age. So what do they do is they plot an HR diagram for these populations, and with isochrones they can fit the ages of these three populations. The oldest population is of the order of 2.5 to 2.7 million years, just from the isochrone fitting. The other one is, I forgot, but it's around 1.7 million years old, and the youngest one is about 1 million years or younger. Now, the interesting thing is that those three stars which I mentioned, I can maybe go just back, have this age, and this was never understood because the ONC, the Orion Nebula Cluster, was thought to be only 1 million years old. And how can these stars have come from the cluster if it's only that age? But now we know that it actually started forming much, much older, and the whole life of this cluster is extended by ejecting the ionizing stars.
Okay. And Annalisa Vary and Andre Debile also asking question. They already typed it. Do you have any constraint on the kinematics of the stars in different populations? I mean,
Yes. Again, that was a slide I had in there, which I've taken out. So the oldest population is spatially significantly more extended than the second oldest population, which itself is significantly more extended than the youngest population. That is, and all of these populations are centered on the center of the ONC, so they are not offset. They are not actually like offset from the center of the ONC. The velocity information from the Gaia data indicates that these populations are indeed sitting in the same potential well. Now, what we next have to do, and this is a project I hope to have done at some point, is to actually do this with N-body, to have these 3 sequences with expulsion one after another, to see if I can reproduce this spatial distribution and kinematics, assuming the ionizing stars eject and expel a significant amount of mass before they're ejected.
Yeah, and the next question is by Andrea Debile, who is asking about the chemical composition of different chemical composition of this population. Can you read that?
Yes, so do these 3 populations have different chemical compositions and ages? The latter should be expected according to the formation model, but is the material already enriched? Plus, I'm also interested in the errors on the age estimates and the statistical significance of the populations. I can clearly see 2 populations, so this third seems to have only a small number of stars. Yes, these are all very relevant issues. So chemical composition has not been measured. There are very young very young stars, pre-main sequence stars. That would be an interesting question to look at. Theoretically, we would not really expect them to have different chemical properties because the massive stars, when they lived for something like 10,000 to 100,000 years before they ejected each other, maybe a few 100,000 years at most. During this time, there wouldn't have been much of an enrichment. The stars have strong winds, but those winds are from the outer surfaces. So it's unlikely that they would be enriching the material significantly unless 2 massive stars would have merged. There's no indication of this happening. Nevertheless, an interesting issue to consider. Now, the errors on the age estimates are, of course, not minor. They are significant, but there's the systematic trend, right? So you have the 3 sequences systematically offset. So I don't know off by heart how large the error is compared to the offset, but I would imagine that it's something like 2 to 3 sigma. Yeah, the third seems to have only a small number of stars. That's correct. The third one is the most tenuous, but there is significant evidence for it to be there. But one can play with various scenarios. One could say, I see the first and second population. Part of the second population is a contamination by binaries from the first, and then the third population could be binaries from the second. Yeah, this could theoretically work and can be investigated, which means perhaps there would be 2 populations, but currently it seems, also given Yerabkova's work on the Gaia data, there are good evidence for 3 populations.
Okay, so the last question is by Shuichiro Inotsaka, who is asking about the episode, the multiple episode of star formation.
Hello, Pavel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello. This is Shuichiro Inotsaka from Japan. Thank you for a very interesting talk.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I think you know the paper by Para and Stara, published around 2000, who identified accelerating star formation over many million years. And actually, their data show that multiple episodes of star formation I think your conclusion is consistent with their picture. So can you comment on this?
Yes, the comment is that I think they were broadly correct in the sense that there's a broad distribution of ages, and possibly, well, it's a question of interpretation, could be accelerating, but we now have much better photometry and data today. That's what Beccari et al. Did using the ESO telescopes. They were able to map this region around the Orion Nebula Cluster with a much higher accuracy. And now they discovered these three populations. So yes, it's a broad brush, broad age distribution of maybe 3-4 million years overall, but it seems to be subdivided into these individual events, bursty events, which Beccari et al. And Yerabkova et al. Have shown to be in the ONC. Nevertheless, it's worth to continue studying this from this perspective. So verify and test the existence of these multiple populations and to see what the star formation history there was. So was it broader? Did it actually start even maybe 10 million years ago? Yeah, this is definitely important to continue to study.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody raise their hand? I think I saw Holger, maybe. Holger, do you have question? I thought that you raised your hand shortly, but maybe I mistake. So, okay, thank you very much again, Pavel. And so